Hi folks, Matt Easton here at the Armoured Fighter event. Hi folks, we're currently training at the Armoured Fighter weekend in Northamptonshire, having great old steel sweaty time. So today we're going to be looking at some secrets, so to speak, of the knightly Pollaxe. Now recently Gavin Locke, my colleague, and I were teaching at the Armoured Fighter event, hosted by Historic Equitation. Fantastic annual event, the Armoured Fighter. Check it out, it's run by Dom Sewell and Toby Capwell. Now during this event, one of the weapons that we were teaching was Pollaxe, although we were also looking at longsword, dagger, wrestling and so on and so forth. But the Pollaxe, in my opinion, is really the knightly weapon par excellence of the 15th century. And here we're going to look at some of the secrets, or rather things that we've observed and learned about using these Pollaxes, specifically in armour. So the first thing to say about this weapon is that, in my view, in the era of full plate harness, let's say the 15th century in this case, because that's what's pertinent to our armours, this is, in my view, the best all-round weapon. Now, it's not to say that some other weapons might be better in other circumstances. If you're in a grappling situation, then obviously a dagger is better. Indoors, for example, a sword might be better, half-swording, than a poleaxe, which you can't manoeuvre. There are specific situations, and some people, I know, dequitum, actually, I believe, prefer the sword to the poleaxe. But overall, I believe the poleaxe is superior all round for a number of reasons, some of which are going to be touched on here, and I'm going to illustrate some of these points with footage from the Armoured Fighter event. Now, one of the key reasons why this weapon works so well for people wearing 15th century plate harness is that you can place your hands widely apart. Why might that be so important, I hear you cry? Well, quite fundamentally, if you put on 15th century plate harness, then the way that you move and the way that you can move and want to move is slightly different to how you can move unarmoured. In fact, it's quite different, quite a lot different. And even fundamental things about these types of gauntlets that you might wear, particularly mitten gauntlets, they do restrict your motion to some extent in different directions. Different gauntlets have different restrictions. But fundamentally, what you don't want to have is a weapon where you're forced to have your hands close together. For the most part, it is more comfortable to have your hands further apart, not just because of the gauntlets, also because of the pauldrons, the breastplate, and so on and so forth. So you want to be able to use weapons whereby changing which foot's forward, so with passing footwork, and having your hands far apart, not only can you apply a lot of leverage to the weapon, but you can move more easily like this. So another so-called secret, not really secret if you practice poleaxe, but for some of you, probably quite a lot of you watching this video, one of the secrets of the poleaxe is you look at this weapon and everyone fixated on this end. Everyone thinks about this as the hitty end, but actually that end's really, really important. So the butt or spike at the back end, or tail, or queue as it's called in le jeu de la hache, is really, really super important to absolutely loads of techniques for a bunch of reasons. Not only can the tail be used in numerous different ways to lock, trip, throw, bind, to knock aside an opponent's weapon, and of course to stab. It is essentially a bit like a spear, so the back end, especially if it has a spike on it, can be used to stab into gaps, in many ways better than the heavier cross end. But in addition to that, it can also be slid forward at different reaches. So by extending forward like that, you can give yourself a lot more reach, or you can choke up in order to use it at close range. And the other important thing to remember about using the tail end is having that end forward keeps the cross end back. So while you're fighting with the back end, this end is already ready and waiting, absolutely gagging for it to come through and strike as well. So both ends are used a lot, but the tail end is used a lot more than most people realise. Now, a very important reason why you might want to use the back end, or queue, or tail, to thrust is it doesn't get caught on stuff. So quite simply, if you're trying to find gaps to poke this into, this can go between a person's arms or between their legs potentially, but also stab into gaps more easily because it doesn't have any lateral projections. If you try and stab with this end, we'll talk about these in a second, But these, while they can be very, very useful for specific techniques, and we'll look at those, these can get in the way. So if you're stabbing with the top end, very often you'll find your own axe gets caught on things and prevents the point from going home where you want it to go. Whereas if you'd used the back end, it would have gone in. Now, as is often the case in martial arts, what goes one way comes back the other way. So the fact that these projections out of the side make it harder sometimes to get the top spike or dag into the opponent, or a gap in their armour, they can also be used, of course. So by the very virtue of the fact that when you're thrusting it might push against something or get caught on something, you can use that. So obviously with these things you can push. Also, if a blow comes down at you, you can block it with these projections at the side, and in fact the axe blades can even catch the incoming blow. And of course you can hook and pull. This should be only too obvious to people who look at something like this. So obviously one disadvantage for stabbing is that these get in the way, but the fact that those get in the way can also be used either to push or hook or pull. Now, I know that I'm guilty on this channel of favouring longer weapons because of their reach advantage, and indeed in unarmoured fighting, reach advantage is one of the major factors. It's really, really optimal. It can be quite OP, for example, spear against sword. However, if you throw armour into the mix, that equation changes entirely, because with the armour you've got the ability to basically close down an opponent. They've got far fewer places where they can actually hit you and wound you, so therefore you can come to close distance much more easily, much more quickly, much more safely. So in that situation, a longer poleaxe can be advantageous in that you can strike an opponent from a distance whereby they can't yet strike you, you can hook them, you can fight against other pole weapons on more equal terms and things like this. You can fight against someone on horseback as well. However, if you're in one-on-one fighting, or indeed melee fighting, where you're close in, what you'll often find is you actually end up choking up your weapon to short range to use it here, either for hooking actions, leverage into their arms to get throws and locks on, or indeed just to stab into a gap when they're very, very close to you. However, what we found was longer weapons, longer poleaxes in specific, and this is, I'm 6'1", so this is maybe about 6'3", 6'4", can be a disadvantage when you come into close range, and sometimes the person with a shorter axe is able to use both ends more easily and turn the weapon around more quickly and more nimbly than the person with the longer weapon. So reach can be an advantage or it can be a disadvantage. It just depends what's happening in the moment. And for that reason, if we look at medieval and early Renaissance art, we do see sometimes longer poleaxes well above head height, and sometimes we see shorter poleaxes which are way below head height, more like Danax length. So clearly different people had different preferences based on what sort of combat they expected to find themselves in, and perhaps even just their personal training and preferences. In case you're wondering, based on our experience, Gavin prefers a shorter poleaxe at the moment. I prefer a slightly longer one. Right, the next point here is rather than factual, it's experience based, and that is keep your shaft smooth. You want to be able to slide your shaft liberally between the hands here. And what we've noticed is that shafts, especially when they're mashing against armour, helmets, other people's weapons, other poleaxes, swords, things like this, they get chewed up. Now, obviously, the type of person using a poleaxe in full plate armour in the medieval period is relatively wealthy, so they're not going to be short of servants to keep their shaft smooth, so to speak. But we found that if your shaft gets chewed up, obviously if you're wearing gauntlets, you've got gloves on the inside, so it might not literally hurt you because the leather should protect you, but the leather and the straps on the inside of the gauntlet can still get caught against the burrs and notches and perhaps even splinters that are on the shaft of the wood. And that's really a disadvantage if you're in the moment of trying to move the axe quickly between, let's say, a long projection in front to a short one because it's caught up in something, or because you want to bring the other end around to bear. If your hand gets stuck as you're sliding up and down the shaft, that can be a real problem. Now, what we also found was a problem, if I just go to the steel poleaxe for a second, and I've talked about this in the past, is these guards and the languettes, and we'll talk about the languettes in a second. Now, when languettes are mounted on top of the shaft like this, rather than embedded and seated into the wood, what you find is, at the bottom of the languettes here, you actually get this lip, and that lip can be really nasty actually. It can dig into your hand, it can wear through your leather gloves or even tear the straps of your gauntlets. But moreover, if they come too far down, they can really obstruct you using the poleaxe in the way that you want to. They can literally get in the way and stop your hand. So you need langets for strength purposes, which, as I mentioned, I'll get to in a second. But you want them to be seated well into the wood and, for the most part, not have massive rivets, in my opinion. Now, some people might say, oh, that can assist the grip. But from my experience so far, and again, I'm learning just like all the rest of us, I'm actually finding that rivets, I don't want rivets to assist my grip. They're more a hindrance to me sliding up and down the shaft. And if we look at most pole arms, whether it's spears, halberds, bills, whatever, you'll find, generally speaking, they've mostly got smooth shafts so that you can enable this sliding up and down, which is really important to using the weapon. Now, on the subject of the guard, while the guard can be useful to protect your hand and protect the opening at the top of the gauntlet from weapons stabbing down into the opening in the hand and into the leather, so they can be beneficial, and they can be beneficial for both pushing a thrust through mail, for example, in an armpit, or just pushing someone away, so they can be useful for that. They come with a disadvantage, and the disadvantage is they get in the way of the head. Now you'll notice this is quite far away from the head. If we look at art, very often that guard is actually up here, so it's much closer to the head. However, and it seems lots of people in history, prefer to have a poleaxe without a guard on. Yes, it leaves you a little bit more exposed. Yes, you don't have something to push against, but it means that you can hold, we do find this in the treatises, you can choke up all the way to the head without having to get past the guard. And in fact, initially one of my training poleaxes had a guard on it, and it was a real pain in the butt, so I removed it. So I personally prefer the ability to slide my hands up and down the shaft whenever I want. So very simple topic, light versus heavy. Some poleaxes are heavier, some are lighter. In fact, if we look at most historical examples, they actually tend to be relatively light, let's say in the 5 or 6 pounds range. I switched over to imperial there. And in fact, this is lighter than some other pole arms, and in fact it's lighter than quite a lot, or a fair number of two-handed swords. So yes, while they are generally speaking top heavy, just pick up the steel one, they are actually overall not that heavy. And by and large, you want a poleaxe to be relatively nimble and relatively quick. So yes, it is a weapon which to some degree relies on impact and having energy behind it, but you don't want it to be so heavy that it's cumbersome, particularly because being able to disengage it, turn it around, easily use both ends and move the weapon quickly is pretty much as important as being able to hit hard. The next thing we've learned is that poleaxes break a lot. Now, I have mentioned this in past videos, but it's been particularly rammed home by the recent Armoured Fighter event at Historic Equitation that you're seeing clips of here in this video, because we had a lot of training poleaxes break, and these aren't even the steel-headed type for the most part. Most of these that broke actually have synthetic rubber, plastic, or whatever, sometimes wooden heads on them. And they come under an awful lot of stress because of the leverage that happens at this end of the shaft near the cross, partly because the mass is above the point of impact, partly because this is made of wood, partly because the other person is using a poleaxe as well, and they're long levers. So for numerous reasons and the way they're constructed, this is a common breaking point around here. So it's no coincidence that when we look at historical or replica poleaxes, they've got langets on them, and the langets usually cover quite a lot of the top of the shaft. So people kind of say, oh, you know, this is to protect it being lopped off by an opponent's sword or halberd. Partially it's to protect the shaft, but largely it's just to keep the head attached to the rest of the weapon, because I can tell you we're not using sharp weapons, and despite that we do get a lot of them break about here just from impact. Now, connected to that is cross section of shaft. Now, there's a bit of a paradox here. You'll notice that I actually have an octagonal shaft on this training weapon, and we found that the octagonal shafts are more durable compared to the usual slightly more rectangular. So this is technically octagonal, but it's essentially a rectangle with the corners shaved off, which does make it into an octagon, admittedly, but you can see it's more rectangular, and this is more rounded, octagonal rounded. Now, this type, the rectangular type, has the advantage of alignment or indexing. It is far, far easier to feel which direction your edge or your hammer or your hook beak are pointing in. Now this is hugely advantageous when it comes to parrying with the blade or the beak, when it comes to hooking behind someone's knee or inside their elbow or around the back of the helmet or this kind of thing. So yes, this rectangular type is advantageous in terms of indexing and technique. However, we found that slightly more rounded shafts are more durable and less likely to break. So I guess you make your choices and you live with the results. Finally, how stiff is your weapon? Because I can tell you that mine is absolutely rock hard. And that's one of the reasons, and why I'm going to finish on, why I love the Pollaxe compared to the longsword or any other sword used in half swording. Okay, so first of all, this is more secure to grip than a blade is. Now admittedly, there are specialized armored fighting swords which are blunt and not sharp edged, but usually when you're handling any type of blade, even if it's a blunted blade, you're dealing with something which is more or less flexible. Now admittedly, I've looked at specialized armored fighting swords in the past and some of them are pretty rigid, but they are never as rigid as a Pollaxe shaft, which is incredibly rigid. Now this gives two main advantages that I absolutely love with the Pollaxe. One is when you are pushing with either the tail end, the cross end or the middle, you are pushing with a really, really rigid bar essentially. When you push with a longsword, yes, you can push in the plane of the edge, but it often turns onto the flat. You are not pushing with something or leveraging with something if you're trying to throw someone, for example, over your knee, around the back of the helmet, you're trying to hook behind someone's knee. You're never leveraging with something as rigid as a Pollaxe. When people do the Mortschlag, for example, when they swing a sword with the hilt end, yes, it's kind of simulating a Pollaxe, but holding a blade and swinging with the pommel end is always a little bit floppy. It never feels great in the hand. Not only is it less secure to grip than a wooden shaft is, but it also just doesn't swing as nicely as a Pollaxe does. And finally, thrusting. When we come to stabbing into someone's armpit or the rear of their skirt or their crotch or the back of their knee or whatever, we're dealing with large forces. Now, if we're just tagging, if we're playing tag and we're saying, oh, any touch, any stab on someone's armpit classes as a point, well, that's fine. A half sword will work fine at that. But if we're actually trying to push a blade through mail, through chainmail that's riveted, good quality, might even be steel mail, then you need force. And once you're into that gap, okay, it doesn't matter whether it's a vision slot or whether it's an armpit or whatever, you have to apply quite a lot of force. Now, swords, yes, they've got a great point on them, but they're not as rigid as a Pollaxe. The Pollaxe has a more rigid and shorter spike. This doesn't flex. It's incredibly powerful, and it's mounted on a shaft that also doesn't flex. So whether you're leveraging to throw, to push, or to stab, this is a much stiffer, and therefore in my hands it feels more reliable weapon to use than the sword. I hope that's been useful and entertaining to watch. Thanks a lot for watching. Thanks again to Historic Equitation for hosting the Armoured Fighter event. And make sure you've clicked a like on this video and subscribed, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.